Hello and welcome to the second AfriCanDo live debates. Today we'll be talking about education in Africa. My name is Estelle Youssouffa. I'm very happy to welcome you here in Morocco for the Atlantic Dialogues. That's a high-level conference organized by the OCP Policy Center. The Policy Center is a Moroccan think tank that brings a southern perspective to key international and economic issues. Now, in addition to the Atlantic Dialogues, there's the Emerging Leaders program, which brings together the best and the brightest minds from the Atlantic Basin, young leaders who've shown exceptional leadership and initiative in their own fields, and they will join us to talk about education in Africa. That's a theme that has been picked by you online, and you decided that that would be the topic of our discussion. So to discuss this, our guests are four Atlantic Dialogues emerging leaders. On my right, there's Idia Irale, an American-Nigerian social justice educator, currently pursuing a master's degree in international education policy at Harvard University. Welcome. Thank you. Next to her is Jean-Claude Muhire, the founder and president of Love the Kids Foundation, a London non-profit organization which looks after socially and economically disadvantaged children. On that side, there's Gudil Simoshi, coming from Tanzania. You're the director of ICT at the University of Dodoma. Dr. Moshi has a PhD in ICT business and economic policy at Waseda University in Tokyo, Japan. Welcome to you. And last but not least, Sandiso CBC. Sandiso is leading the Open Innovation for Africa at Accenture, where she's helping startups with market access opportunities to accelerate their growth. Welcome to you all. We're very privileged to have you with us on this set. I also want to welcome our viewers. You can jump in the discussion. We want you to jump in on social media using the hashtag AfriCanDo and the hashtag Emerging Leaders. Now, before we start this discussion, I want to set the record straight on education in Africa. With more than 60% of its population under the age of 25, sub-Saharan Africa is the world's youngest region. By 2030, Africa will be home to more than 1/4 of the world's under 25 population, with more than 830 million African youth. 1 billion African children will need an education in the coming 3 decades. The business of private education in sub-Saharan Africa is estimated to $16 to $18 billion over the next 5 years. And almost 20 million young Africans join the workforce every year, but there's only 3 million jobs that are being created on the official formal job market. It is predicted that almost half of all the work activities in Africa could be replaced by automation. So that gives you a broad idea, but to frame this discussion, I'm lucky enough to have the Moroccan pundit and sustainable development advocate Mamoun Ghallab with us. Mamoun will give you a few thoughts to kickstart the debate.
Thank you, Estelle. We all heard things like Africa has a great human potential, Africa is the youngest continent, and it's the future of humanity. Well, for me, for this future to be a bright one, I think what we need today is to find a way to enable this African human potential and make it a real asset for an inclusive and sustainable development. Enabling human potential goes through building efficient education systems, systems that shape a positive problem-solving mindset among youth, systems that offer youth life skills and also relevant curricula in vocational training and in universities. Also, education systems that foster R&D, which is a very, very important thing, and mostly building bridges between innovation and market so that a researcher can give birth to a real solution that impacts the real world. The question is how can we achieve that? And I would like to draw the outline of the situation we're facing with some facts. When we talk about education, we talk about equal access to education. Equal access to education in terms of gender, we're doing quite good in Africa. On average, we have 9 girls for every 10 boys in African schools. When we talk about social equality, there we have a problem because 70% of rural children have never stepped a foot in schools, and a poor child is 5 times less likely to finish primary school than his wealthy mates. In terms of quality of education, the problem is big also. Firstly, because we have a massive school dropout rate. About 42% of the African children leave school too early. And also, we lack of teachers. We estimate that we would need about 1 million additional teachers to reach the school for all objective, not talking about quality, just school for all. Higher education and access to jobs. The enrollment has doubled in the beginning of this century, but still only 6% of the children that begin primary school have the opportunity to get to university. Also, there's a lack of vocational training. There's a problem with the relevance of curricula in university because, for example, in Morocco, the more diplomas you have, the more chances you have to be unemployed. And in South Africa, I think it's more or less the same thing. Enabling innovation and R&D ultimately is a very important thing. R&D in Africa has tripled in the last 15 years, which is great, but still it only represents 1% of the global R&D in the whole world. And this is because of a lack of funding and a lack of opportunities of PhD and research in African university. I don't want to be drawing a pessimistic panorama, but we can consider that there are positive trends. Great progress regarding the Millennium Goals and SDGs regarding education, a lot of initiatives to foster innovation among young entrepreneurs and allow them to innovate. But still, when we consider that 1 billion children will need to go to school within 20 years, well, I think the situation has to be a warning call for us and for our governments.
Thank you, Mamoun. You give us plenty of ideas to chew on. And indeed, education raises multiple questions. How do you make sure that privatization of education in Africa does not feed inequality? Are we educating citizens or employees or entrepreneurs? How do you build a workforce when you don't know what jobs and market strengths and needs will actually be in a few years? How do you close the continent's skills gap? How do you breed R&D to create African innovation? Many questions to discuss. Luckily, we have the best panel with us. I want our guest views on that, and I'll start with Idia. You're an education practitioner. The numbers are a bit overwhelming. Do you think that Africa can rise up to the challenge?
I do, yeah. I think that, you know, when we look at these numbers, they seem a little bit sad. And then we realize we have a very young population, which is scary, because that means that there's urgency in a lot of African countries. But I also think that to look at our population being so young as kind of a deficit is the wrong way to look at it. We can also look at it as an opportunity. Having such a young population means that a lot of African countries have a lot of potential that they can channel into. We don't have a lot of time to figure it out, but we can figure it out. I definitely think we can.
But do you think we can transform this demographic boom into a demographic dividend? There is, you know, that's the tricky part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that one thing that we really should start to really take seriously is to build holistic students that have knowledge in various fields, are well-rounded, and are able to market those skills. Because when we talk about the skill gap, I think lots of education systems will see that and say, oh, we need to have our children be really good at tech. We need to make sure that we can have students that can code, for example. But we don't know in 10 years what the next thing is going to be. We don't know what the market's going to look like. So to make sure that our students are well-rounded and capable to contribute to any labor market, especially other labor markets in Africa, I think that is really important. We need to make sure that they can do that.
We'll see how. Yeah. Jean-Claude, next to you, is working with the younger ones. You work with children from impoverished backgrounds in Rwanda. How can we make sure that they not only receive an education, that's a start, but they receive a good education? Can, you know, we bear in mind that second-class education can deepen the existing social and economic gaps?
Yeah, thank you. The fact here is to select the children to support, to go to the primary to secondary school. You know, Rwanda is one of the developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And what we do, just have some criteria to select the children to support and then commit to help them to.
So you detect the potential?
Yeah, we detect the potential. So, for example, we have 103 children, and then they are coming from different backgrounds. And it's very tough for us to send every single child to the school because of, first, the funding, and then the second is some of them who have been drop out the school because of different factors. So if you take someone, for example, from the street, you don't need to immediately send him to the school. But you only have to also provide such kind of informal education so that he can also have the ability to attend the school, to join back the school.
What would be an informal education? What are you talking about?
Yeah, informal education is that, for example, we have like a library at the foundation. How can we be sure that a child have a certain of education before going back to the education, to the school?
To the system.
Yeah, to the system. So before going to the formal education at the school, he deserves also another kind of education, like a mentoring program. We do the mentoring program at the foundation so that he can also have such kind of knowledge to prepare him to attend some basics at the school so that he can also know how to live with other students. So the issue of providing the quality education, also just like I said about the funding, it's very tough, but we make sure that we already have some partners at the foundation, so we'll collaboratively with them, and then we can try to invest in the education, send a few number of children to schools, so step by step. Yeah.
Step by step and by being selective.
Yeah, by
that's
being
that's
selective.
What you mean.
Yeah.
Ghallab, you're working with, teenagers. They are at the university. African universities are notoriously underfunded. We're lucky enough to be here in the Mohammed VI University near Marrakesh. It's a gorgeous, spectacular university, brand new. They're aiming to address the African market education. How do you see this being workable on the continent? Because obviously, one university cannot do it all. You're having, you said, 25,000 students. Yes. How do you manage to attract enough professors? That's what Mamoun mentioned. We don't have enough professors.
Yeah, that's true. We don't have enough professors, but and also in the past we have suffered from brain drain. But the story is changing right now. The story is changing, and it's, because in the past 15 years, African economies have performed, substantially well. Not very well, but economies are growing, and also the government spending on education is growing. And anybody would like to stay where things are moving. If things are stagnant, then they cannot stay. It's not encouraging for them to stay.
You mean that the environment is helping you keep the professors?
Yes, help us keep the professors. And also, I can give you an example myself. I was trained in Japan. And I had fellows from other African countries, and currently most of them are going back because they want to go back and build their countries. Somehow there's this realization that, hey, I can do something in Africa. I can go there and train. I can go there and participate in various initiatives that could not have happened 20 years ago.
You think it's important that the returnees bring back this spirit to Africa and that they contribute? Do you think that's a good motivation for them?
That's a good motivation. That is a very, very good motivation. We want people to go back, but also those who, stay abroad, they have something to do in Africa, even though they are abroad. Why am I saying so? In several countries, you find people who were, employed in universities like Harvard. They go back to their countries after I have spent like 20 years abroad, and they come with all this wealth of knowledge and expertise and connections that helps actually these global South institutions to rise up in a way that they could not have done that if those connections were not there. And
so you mean that the diaspora can bring the global to Africa,
yes,
the global world,
exactly,
and there's a huge potential there.
Yes.
My question, and I'm a journalist by training, so I would be a bit tricky.
Yeah.
It's true that the returnees are motivated by the love of Africa, and there is opportunities there, but how do you keep them? I will go back to my initial question. Do you have enough funding to pay for these professors? They have different standards. Returnees are not paid with the same local salaries.
The truth is, we don't have those huge salaries. I mean, countries in first world, they can pay for professors. But now, I mean, people are going back with this realization that they can do more than working at a university. They can help startups, they can help communities, they can engage with communities, and they get satisfaction more than money can give. So, of course, there is the salary part of it, the financial remuneration part of it, but there is additional rewards that these professors can get by engaging with their own communities that they cannot do the same when they are abroad. So these other, I will say that we still need funding. We still need lots of funding, and funding not only to keep professors, but to push on research, for example.
R&D, yeah, we're gonna talk about it, but it's Sandiso actually who will address that, because to feed growth and obtain economic education growth, Africa will need to stem innovation. At the moment, it's just 1% of the global innovation. Africa can do more. There's potential, but then you need to actually make it concrete and go bigger and materialize. How do you do that?
So I think with innovation, I think the fundamental challenge we face as Africa is infrastructure. Where we've got a lot of good ideas, but implementing them or rolling them out to different parts of Africa is quite a challenge. So, for example, I'll take the cell phone example. So if I were wanting to do a course on Coursera, an online learning platform to educate myself, I would, as an African person, I'd first struggle with, okay, the device. So smartphones are typically very expensive devices. And then secondly, so let's say I get the device, I win a prize somewhere, and I have the device, and then I would look to, okay, so now I want to actually use it, then I would need data. And therefore, data is another big challenge in Africa. It's not readily available, it's not free, and it's also quite expensive. So even when I do have data, then I have the third barrier, which is then infrastructure. And then I have a mobile device, I have the data, but then I'm living in a rural area where there's just not enough
internet connection.
Right. So it's, so like innovation is primarily fueled by technical infrastructure, and we don't have that sorted out in Africa to begin with. Yeah,
that's one point. So I'm gonna, we're gonna come back to this point. I want you to take a look at a few facts on education with this video. So apparently we had a little technical problem. We're going to try again and see if the video is actually working.
Yet there remains a lot to be done.
Promoting higher education is one of the African Union's main current goals. Is it necessary to boost higher education in order to fuel innovative economies? In the 1970s, 200,000 sub-Saharans were in higher education. Now, over 10 million sub-Saharans are in higher education. But there appears to be a mismatch on the marketplace. For example, South Africa in 2012 had over 800,000 vacant private sector jobs and 600,000 jobless graduates. Which begs the question, is the African education system meeting the development needs of the continent? With 1 in 9 sub-Saharan Africans with a higher education living in OECD countries, stopping the brain drain, building an education system able to feed an inclusive system seem to be the biggest challenges facing Africa and its booming youth. To make sure the African demographic bulge brings demographic dividends, all serious ideas to develop African education's potential for breeding innovators deserve serious consideration. Learn the facts and join the debate using hashtag AfriCanDo.
So you saw there are plenty of facts and figures. We're doing better, but we're not doing enough. Is it possible to actually school 1 billion children in 3 decades? Will Africa need to leapfrog and to reinvent education? Do you think we can do it?
I think that we already are reinventing education. A lot of developing countries, not just in Africa, but if you look at South Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, a lot of people are developing community schools where, for instance, a rural child who cannot make it to school or who cannot deal with the opportunity cost of being in school for half the day might have a school in their community or a small classroom in their community where they can learn from a community member who might not be a teacher, but to be honest, a lot of teachers in African countries are not necessarily set up with the skills that they have in rural communities anyway. So, you know, this is an idea, this is a way that people are already reinventing education, because if the schools aren't meeting the standards, then the communities can take it upon themselves and use the resources that they already have.
Mamoun, I see that you're
Yes,
agreeing.
I really like this idea of reinventing education, and I have an example that is very inspiring. In Kenya, there's a startup called Shupavu that is doing education through text messages. We were talking about the problem of accessing the internet. Everyone, or most of the people, have a phone that receives text messages.
We're equipped in mobile phones, but they're just low tech.
Yeah, not smart ones.
That's the issue.
So, and they are reaching over more than 100,000 children in Kenya, and they're expanding to the neighboring countries also. And these children can answer quiz to complement their school, or even do the whole program with the phone when they're in rural areas. And it works very well.
Jean-Claude, do you think that the children you're working with could embrace this sort of technology? Do you think that we will need to go beyond whatever we imagined so far to educate the 1 billion African children that will need an education soon?
I think we can. All we need to do, I think the government should strengthen the partnership between the government and the private institution, because we know that there are some companies who invest like in the mining, in energy. If they invest in the education sector, we're pretty sure that all children or young people can have easy access to education. I think that education should also have an investment so that people who do not have access to education should easily have access to attending such kind of schools, for example. The only challenge that we have is not so many people or companies do not invest in education. If you have some kind of investment in education, I'm pretty sure that we can do.
I'm sure that you were alluding to the fact that OCP Group, who is welcoming us today, actually is one of the founders of this university. As a Moroccan mining group, they are taking their commitment to the community very seriously. Do you cringe when you hear that the private sector needs to jump in?
definitely the private needs to jump in.
We don't have a choice.
We don't have a choice. I mean, as Africa, I mean, governments cannot fund it, cannot do it all alone. I mean, because, I mean, the task ahead of us is too huge to let it to the governments by themselves. So, I mean, I actually believe that we need actually to, I mean, all that we have at our disposal should be poured into this task. And from an economic perspective, I mean, we need a very able labor so as to contribute to economic activities in our countries. So unless we create that, we will have, I mean, we will have people who are potentially, I mean, labor, but I mean, potentially very good labor, but if they are not trained to what we have at our stake, then...
You're talking about the skill gap.
Yeah, the skill gap.
Which is already identified as a big problem for the business community. But it goes back to your point, you know, how do you know which skills will be necessary? Is it life skills? You know, the WEF published an analysis where they mentioned the fact that it's not hard skills per se, but more general education, social.
I'll give you a story.
Please do.
Actually, my experience, I mean, kind of observation. I mean, 15 years ago, when I was 15 years ago, when I was at high school, the issue with Africa was technology transfer. Technology transfer was the problem. But today, you don't hear about it anymore. I mean, it's something else. Why? Because now you can learn anything and you can buy technology if you want to. And most of our problems in Africa, they can be solved if our people were able to learn these issues. I mean, lots of platforms, from Coursera to Udacity, these are online learning platforms. Even YouTube is an online learning platform nowadays, if you choose to. And now I think the most important skill for our people is to teach them how to learn. And
so it's not about knowledge itself, it's how to access knowledge.
How to access knowledge and use that knowledge, I mean, and adapt it to your own environment to solve your problems. I think.
Sandy, so I think that you seem to be agreeing.
Yeah.
I would come back to what Gudjar mentioned, which is you create an environment to enable education, but it goes to the government and then the private sector can help. How can government as well as the private sector work together to enable innovation, R&D? You know, what will actually help Africa play a bigger role and not just be the working force, the labor, but more the creators in the next century?
So I think it just goes back to the whole public-private partnerships we need to be building as an African community. And I think, as you've said, that the problem is far too big for just the government to solve. And I think the private sector must not get involved as a charity, but rather it actually serves their profitability margins by actually investing in education, because they're the ones that speak about the skills gap. And I think they're the ones that need to come to the table and say, we need skills in the following sectors, and then pull their resources into the picture and actually help educate people to address the skills that they're looking for. And I think that's for me is probably the biggest gap that is probably existing right now, that there's a skills gap. There's the stat the video just showed now speaks about how there was 800,000 jobs in Africa, but only 600,000 graduates, but there was just a skills mismatch. And that's part of it. And I think also private sector, if we want to be an innovative private sector, I think we need to educate people, and just like how he said, how to learn innovation and how to be exposed to certain things, and therefore you become innovative.
Do you think that we create the environment that allows innovation, as in try and error? Because innovation in a way is also about, you know, you will fail, but you will need to do it again. Do we have this environment in Africa? So
the short answer for me is no. I feel like in Africa, when you try something and you go out and you do something different, people always like, I mean, when you want to be like a music star and you tell your parents, they're like, oh no, you can't be a musician, you're never going to make money, and it's because people are so afraid of failure.
And in Africa, when you try an idea, an innovative idea, if you fail, like your neighbors look at you like, oh, what were you trying? Just work at a normal job like the rest of us. So it's almost like discouraged to actually fail. Whereas I think the reason why Silicon Valley is so far ahead in innovation is because the mindset there is try, fail, fail fast, fail forward, and eventually you'll get it. So in Africa, when you fail, people ask you like, how did you fail? What did you fail? In Silicon Valley, once you fail, the question is,
what did you learn from it?
What did you learn? Exactly, that's it. What did you learn? Yes, exactly.
Do you think you're working with young ones, Jean-Claude? Do you think that the new generation has a new mentality? Do you think that the mindset is changing?
Yeah, it's changing through, for example, at my organization, changing through the collaboration of the staff of my organization and with their families, because we also empower
to the elders as well.
Yeah, we're talking to the elders, I mean their families, to also support them in many ways. I cannot maybe try to live with all the children, but because they have the family which take care of them also, so it's better that it's a great way to also to empower them to grow up in good conditions.
And something that is quite interesting about children is that they're huge agents of change.
Yeah, sure.
Once you educate the children, they will educate the parents.
Yeah,
and it's usually not the usual way.
Yeah. I think that one of the best things for the children is that if you tell them something, it is very easy for them to also communicate with you, because they're going to say that, okay, at my family, things are like this. So what we can do to improve them, so it's going to be very easy for us. Because we have the communication, the strong communication between us and the children, and then to the parents. And I think that's a very big communication.
You were about to jump in.
Yeah, I was about to jump in actually on the issue of public-private partnership. And there are many models how government and private sector can work together. But one of them is, just come on the table, put all, cards on the table and say, there are things government is good at doing that can reduce cost of doing business for, enterprises that do want to venture in education. And if we can know exactly what are those, areas that government can actually lower cost of doing business. It's not a direct,
transaction,
but reducing those barriers will actually reduce the price tag that goes to the citizens and actually provide more access at the end to those citizens.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that another thing that the government can do, and this would also speak to the point on failure, is they can provide enough infrastructure so that the stakes are not so high. Because I think that one issue with failure in Africa is maybe not necessarily the attitude, but the fact that if you fail, you're affecting a lot of people. Whereas if you fail on Silicon Valley, you still have that security network underneath you to make sure that you can still eat, at the end of the day, and you're not negatively affecting so many people's lives. So I think that governments really, really need to make sure that the children, innovators, anyone has that security network underneath them to make sure that all of this innovation can happen without such high stakes.
I think we're almost out of time. I will take just one question from our viewers. They've been very active online, and I'm very thankful. So one question to you all, and you can jump in to answer. Education isn't just for the young. Do you think we should invest to update older citizens on new technology? Thoughts?
Yes. Yes,
yes?
we should.
Short answer is yes?
Course, yeah. And I think that it's the hard part about educating older generations is that we don't have the structures for that in any system, in African systems, in American education systems. They're out of school already, so it's a population that you can't say, okay, everybody, at 6 o'clock you're gonna come here. So I really liked the point of making sure that the children are communicating to their families as well, and setting up channels so that the whole community is involved and making sure that parents are really understanding how to use new technologies as well.
Jean-Claude, are parents receptive?
Yeah, Yes, we should, because as long as we support the children, we also do not want their families to be left behind. We work collaboratively with them, and then we just want to empower their families. For example, in Rwanda, you see someone who is like 30 years old with like 10 children. Oh, wow. So what we do is also to see
30 years old and already
30 years old,
10
like
children.
10 children. So we also deserve to give him such quality of such education on sexual and health rights, so that he can also know, for example, how he can continue, he can stop to give birth to a certain number of children they cannot be able to raise. So I think with such kind of empowering them through giving them like entrepreneurship skills, the knowledge on sexual and reproductive health, that can be a very great tool that can help them to have a certain education here, I think.
Sandiso, do you think that parents are receptive?
I think parents are receptive to technology when you expose them to it. In most cases, and then there's just those few people that are like, oh no, tech, no, thank you.
Hopeless cases.
Yes. But I also think for me, given the limited resources we have as Africa, I would rather focus on the biggest problem, which is young people. It's important to educate our senior citizens, but I don't think we
You think you have to make hard choices,
yes,
and you
yes.
would focus the effort
Yes,
on the youth.
yes.
Gudiel?
I like the question, but I mean, I was kind of thinking, but who should do it? I mean, the question was, should we? Yeah. And my question was,
yes, but who?
Who should do it? I mean, the government, the civil society, the private sector. I mean, because we haven't. I mean, morally, yes, we should morally, but who should do it? And I think yes, we should, but here I call for innovations. I mean, all of us. I mean, civil society, private sector, government, but more of the innovation. I mean, we didn't teach our grandmas on how to use Facebook. Yeah. But it was designed so easily, such a way that they could learn.
Grandma joined.
Yeah, they
and
joined.
Hopefully she's watching at the moment.
Of course. So I think all of us should do it, but innovation is the key. If we have good enough innovation, then these people want to keep their jobs, then definitely
they will jump in the wagon.
Yes.
I think that our time is actually up, and I will turn to Mamoun for a few thoughts to wrap things up.
Thank you. Well, the main idea, I think, to keep in mind is that our youth has to become a dividend and a real potential. And for that, we have to foster the adaptability of the youth so that they can go with the changes of our world, and also teach them how to fail forward, as you said. For this, we have to explore new models of education that give mostly life skills, soft skills, and not only technical or classical education. We have to develop to connect people with knowledge through technology. We also have to take better advantage of our potential. For example, the diaspora and keeping the talent. This is an asset that we have, and we have to take the better out of it. And also, fundings are very important, but they have to be used wisely. Government, communities, NGOs, everyone has to contribute. Private sector also, and I think we have to do it reconsidering and reinventing education, reconsidering its goals and the means of education, because we don't want to have children in classrooms, we want to have children that become agents of change, as we said it, and that efficiently contribute to the development of our continent.
Because Africa can do it.
Yes, we can.
That's the theme of AfriCanDo. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming in and sharing your thoughts and expertise. I want to thank you for watching. You can keep the conversation going or catch up on the beginning of the discussion if you were late. So you can use the hashtag AfriCanDo, the hashtag Emerging Leaders on social media, or at ATL_dialogues, or at OCP Policy Center, or at OCP Group, you name it. You can find us online. Tomorrow, don't miss Mamoun. He'll be covering the Atlantic Dialogues with exclusive interviews. Again, thank you so much from all the AfriCanDo team. Goodbye.